Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about one of my personal most anticipated films of the year, Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. In theaters now. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So, as many of you guys probably already know by now, I am a massive Tolkien guy, enough so that I felt the need to munch popcorn out of a big plastic hammer collectible popcorn bucket while I watched this movie because, hey, why not? So obviously I've been very curious just about this film. I think kind of J.R.R. Tolkien's fantastical world has always been like full of unexpected journeys, but as like an anime adaptation of a very like lesser known Tolkien narrative, The War of the Rohirrim does offer to take audiences on a very unique Middle-earth adventure. But one of the big selling points for this film is the fact that like leading us down that uncharted path are some familiar guides, because that's right, the band is back together as Peter Jackson and Philippe Boyens return to Middle-earth really for the first time since the conclusion of their beloved live-action trilogy back in 2003. And the result is like a cinematic experience that somehow feels both like excitingly fresh and comfortingly familiar. I think kind of the anime style and just the lengthy runtime may deter some viewers, but with like beautiful animation, I think memorable characters, and just an action-packed story, I think War of the Rohirrim is a worthy return to Middle-earth. And Peter Jackson's like Lord of the Rings trilogy is among like the most cherished and acclaimed films really ever made, claiming staggeringly, I think 17 Academy Awards, and I think establishing like the template for Middle-earth storytelling, at least for like a modern audience. But like prior to those films, Tolkien stories were previously only available through animated adaptations such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings back in 1977 and 78. And I do think that like returning Middle-earth to its like animated roots does prove to be like a wise choice that just helps this movie avoid like the inevitable and like almost certainly like unfavorable comparisons to Jackson's like excellent film trilogy. And the decision to like focus on a relatively small and like isolated event, just like a regional human conflict 183 years before the events of the trilogy, may feel like a little bit anticlimactic to audiences who are accustomed to the more like world-ending stakes and like cosmic battles between good and evil, like in Tolkien's more famous tales. But I think kind of like the more narrow scope does allow this film to kind of stand on its own and form its own identity. And as like a quick disclaimer, I have to say that like while recognizing like the incredible artistry involved, I have just never personally been a fan of anime. I think if you love it, that's great. I've just never like found myself clicking with it. And I think kind of in The War of the Rohirrim, like the characters' designs are excellent. I think the landscape visuals are gorgeous, but there still are some like just quirks of the genre, such as very choppy character movements that do require some adjustment. But that being said, like, after probably the initial like 20 minutes or so, my brain did adapt to the style, and I found that I was just fully immersed into this story. And I think it also helps that like this movie is set in the same like cinematic universe as Peter Jackson's films, which does allow like direct kind of visual continuation from the film trilogy. And even like the musical themes from Howard Shore's like iconic film score also makes a very like triumphant return in this film. I think some viewers may feel that these elements are a bit of like cheap attempts just to like tug on audience nostalgia, but I think kind of the familiarity of it does effectively kind of bridge the gap for audiences like myself who are accustomed to like the anime style. And narratively, like the story of this film does derive from just two scant pages that are found in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings. In other words, like beyond just the basic bare bones of like the narrative events, most of the story is an invention of the filmmakers and not, coming directly from Tolkien. For example, like Hera, who is the central protagonist in this movie, is mentioned but not even named in Tolkien's original writing. And yet, despite that, at least for me personally, like there were just no moments in this film that made me groan and think, Tolkien never would have done that. Unlike, some aspects I think of like Amazon's The Rings of Power series. The story is not like a direct adaptation of Tolkien's writing, but at least in the opinion of this Tolkien fanboy, I do think it is faithful to like the overall spirit of those writings. I think like large portions of the plot are obviously original inventions, but like central Tolkienian themes of like heroism and courage and kind of like in the face of death and tragedy remain very prevalent. And I think a challenge for like modern Tolkien adaptations is that his stories are predominantly, almost exclusively like male centric. And yet like despite kind of that reputation, Tolkien's female characters are often like among his best, and I do think that Hera feels like worthy to be counted among them. Because I just found her to be a very like well-constructed character that is much more than just sort of the tough, need-no-man warrior woman that some people may have feared just like based on the movie's marketing material alone. I found her character's journey to feel very earned and satisfying. I think significantly too, like her elevation in the story also does not come at the expense of any like the original story's like prominent male figures. For example, like the very hyper masculine Helm Hammerhand, who is voiced excellently by Brian Cox. He's fantastic. I think easily like this story's standout character. He's definitely one of the most like heavy metal characters I have seen in a long time. I do think kind of like the rest of the cast, like both male and female, are all given moments to shine. I think it's also important to note that like despite being animated, the War of the Rohirrim is actually like darker and more violent than I think previous Lord of the Rings adaptations. I think kind of the more like grim and serious tone is consistent with like Tolkien's wider legendarium beyond like the Hobbit-centric tales, but it might be like unexpected for casual audiences. And so I think parents should like just be aware that like this is a PG-13 film, and while I don't think it's like inaccessible to younger viewers, it's not like primarily targeted toward them. My own two like 10-year-old sons who have both watched like the live-action trilogy came with me to see this movie. They both loved it, but like the violence and like the intensity probably did hit like the upper limits of their current capacity. And this is like a quick PSA for parents. Kind of like the trailers that were shown before this movie, at least in my theater, were definitely not kid friendly. A lot of eye covering, ear plugging going on. So if you are planning to like bring your kids to this movie, maybe just plan to skip out on the previews. As far as kind of to consider things going on the surface of this, for language, there are, that I counted, like 2 uses of the D word, but then nothing beyond that. Most of the content in this does come, as I mentioned, from violence, where like, unlike the Lord of the Rings trilogy, most of the action in this movie is like human on human, which does give the violence like a bit of like a harsher dimension. I think like, kind of the animated style does soften like the impact of that violence, but there is like slightly more blood than you would find in the live action films. Because like plenty of warriors are killed in battle, and like kind of like the most like visceral instances of that include a man that gets his hand severed off, and you see the hand fall and like blood coming from it. There's also a warrior that gets shot in the eye with an arrow, and another one arrow that pierces through the man's neck. And there's also a scene where a character sort of violently has his throat cut, and like the deed itself happens like just off screen, so you don't see it, but it can be heard. And lastly, kind of sexuality. The only thing that comes to mind for this is there is a man who like fairly aggressively attempts to like force a woman to marry him against her will. As far as themes, worldview, like things going on beneath the surface, to me, I think the central theme all throughout the War of the Rohirrim is about choice. I think kind of like in an immediate sense, the theme can be applied to Hera's experience as a woman. As I said earlier, I think Hera is like much more nuanced than merely being a female empowerment icon. Although at the same time, I think she is clearly intended to reflect Éowyn from the Lord of the Rings movies, who actually serves as the narrator of this film, as a woman who like, just doesn't fit into the expectations of a patriarchal society, and who would rather go on an adventure than go get married. And it kind of all throughout, she pushes back against like her father's intentions of an arranged marriage, and just expresses her desire to like have a say in her own future. And on several occasions, sort of like her wise mentor in this film counsels her that she has a choice. And those words certainly I think can be applied to her personal struggles as a woman, but I think kind of in the context of those specific scenes, they're also intended in like a more deeper universal sense. Hera can choose to like marry or not marry, but she also has the power to choose like just to not be afraid, or despair in the face of overpowering enemies, and to instead choose to ride out and face it head on, or the choice to show mercy to those who have shown her none. I think kind of like likewise like the male characters in this, such as Helm and Wolf, who's the antagonist, are also just faced with constant decisions of whether to conform to like the violent cultural norms of their of their time, or to sort of set aside their pride and like rise above them. And J.R.R. Tolkien once wrote, that The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. I think Christian themes have always like permeated his stories, although like due to like the smaller narrative scope, kind of the more cosmic themes of good versus evil are not like maybe as like upfront in the War of the Rohirrim. I think even at first glance, the film may seem to be like more morally ambiguous, like in the mold of the Game of Thrones. But while like I think the characters may not like conform as easily to just simple categories of like good guy, bad guy. And to be fair, like I don't think they ever have in Tolkien's writing. I think like the consequences of their action clearly do reflect like a biblical notion of like absolute standard of good and evil. Not all like noble deeds lead to happy endings, but I think true to Tolkien's Christian worldview, it is sort of like Christian virtue and like strength of character and not just strength of arms that ultimately like does win out in the end. I think in this like good and evil are absolutes, but humans are flawed and must constantly like choose to do good. I think it is sort of the flawed and like imperfect nature of these characters that does make sort of the glimpses of heroism and sacrificing just more inspiring. So in the end, at least in the opinion of this Lord of the Rings fan, I think like the War of the Rohirrim is a very enjoyable, if somewhat inconsequential, entry into like the expanding world of Tolkien adaptations. The movie is like consistently entertaining, even if I do think the runtime is over long. And despite the very, I think, fresh like anime aesthetic, the plot itself does retread many of like the same story elements like directly from the Two Towers. But like, I think for like every narrative parallel or like nostalgic return of a familiar location or character, there are also just plenty of other moments or visuals or like creative decisions that do expand and I think offer a unique perspective on Tolkien's world. And as a result, I think War of the Rohirrim just strikes a satisfying balance, managing to feel, bold and daring, even as it heeds the sage advice of Gandalf and avoids straying too far off the familiar path. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you're a big Tolkien fan, or, hey, let me know if you're impulsive enough like me to buy a big hammer popcorn bucket. Don't be shy. Jump in the comment section. Let's have a conversation about this. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe, have a great Christmas, and continue to collide through World for Christ.